really. We're in John chapter 18. John 18. John chapter 18, before you start John 18, would be the record of the Garden of Gethsemane in the other Gospels. So if you it seems that he probably saw the lights from their torches as they approached. Whatever gave it away that they were coming. A large number of soldiers, by the way, and they would have made quite a racket stomping through the night, so maybe you heard them coming, and my accusers are here. They're here. It's time. So you move from that Garden of Gethsemane account to what we find in chapter 18. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. When Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "Of these whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" And 1 through 11 is really about the betrayal of Judas. Now, there are some other things included in those verses 1 through 11, but as they cross the Kidron Valley, which is at the bottom of the Kidron Valley would be the Kidron River. There's a problem right there, Joe. It can't unplug.
That's okay.
Still got me?
Oh, yeah.
So as they cross the Kidron Valley, they'd be crossing the Kidron River, or a little creek. And as they cross that, then somewhere in that vicinity would be the Garden of Gethsemane. So as they are in that particular place, it is obvious that Judas has done his deed, and he has led those who would arrest Jesus to Jesus. The obvious answer to how they knew where to find him is Judas knew where Jesus often went, and Judas knew that Jesus spent a lot of time there, and obviously the Garden of Gethsemane, one of those very popular places for Jesus to frequent, whether it's a place of prayer as he's done tonight, whatever reason he may have frequented the Garden of Gethsemane. But Judas would have known about that. He would have known. Now, Judas's timeline seems to be run up a little bit by Jesus, because as Jesus is there in the upper room in chapter 13 with his disciples, maybe Judas, it seems, is going to wait till after supper to leave so he won't be so obvious. But Jesus says, go do what you got to do. Go ahead, go now. Go do it. Go do what you've got to do. So Jesus may have moved his timeline up a little bit because Jesus knew that the time was at hand. His time is there. So he sends Judas on his way. So Judas arrives with the entourage that's with him, as is described here, a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They had lanterns and torches and weapons, and as they approach, Jesus begins to confront them with what their duty is. Notice in verse 4, it says that Jesus knew. Let's see how it puts it. Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" Jesus' surrender at this point is a very conscious surrender. He knew exactly what was taking place. There was nothing out of sorts. There was nothing to him that was out of place. Everything was working as had been planned. And one of the things that Jesus knows is that those things that are going to happen to him are going to happen to him. And so he begins that process. Who is it that you seek? And he did not try to run. He didn't try to hide. He didn't try to fight. As a matter of fact, when Peter tries to fight by cutting off the specific ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest, I believe it's Luke that says Jesus put it back on, put his ear back on. John doesn't say that. Cut off his right ear, and then he chastises Peter, put your sword back in the sheath. The issue is that I have to drink this cup that I have to drink. Now remember, in the Garden of Gethsemane, it is remove this cup from me. Remove this, if there's any other way, remove this cup from me. That cup of suffering that he must drink. Jesus using a figure of speech that he often does to describe his consummation. As a matter of fact, these last chapters, the events that take place are often called the time of consummation, when Jesus will be crucified, when he'll be killed and on that cross. So he sends out Judas to do the deed, and Judas may be a little bit ahead of his timeline, at least according to the way I look at it, that Judas probably was waiting till after supper, which would have been the way that you would probably do it. You wouldn't leave right in the middle of supper to go out and betray Jesus. So Jesus says, go do it. And so Judas arrives, and Jesus does not try to deny. He doesn't try to deflect. He doesn't do anything of the sorts. As a matter of fact, his surrender is a very conscious surrender. He deliberately gives himself over He gives himself over to those who have come to take him. And it is actually a fulfillment of several of the Psalms, but one of those, Psalm 27, describes the fact that when the enemies come, he will surrender. That's the idea. Now, when he speaks, "I am he," they fall back. Now, Psalm 27, I think it's verse 2, says, "When his enemies come, they will fall to the ground." That could very easily be also a prophecy of what will take place there. His enemies will stumble and fall back. So the surrender of Jesus was very conscious. It wasn't something that caught him by surprise or something that he hadn't planned for. It was something that he saw coming. He knew it was coming. He had already prayed in the garden, "If there's any other way, please take this cup from me." And as he prays that prayer 3 times, he always concludes it by saying, "Not my will, but your will be done." And as a result of all of that, when he rises from that prayer, he lets the disciples know that the time is here. It's time. My accusers are here. And so he confronts them that are there to arrest him by simply asking, "Who is it you seek?" "We're seeking that Jesus of Nazareth." And his reply is, "I am he." Then he asks again, "Who is it that you seek?" And they say, "We're looking for that Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I've told you already, I am he. I told you that I am he. So let these other men go. I'm the one you want." And so he gives himself up, consciously giving himself up. I believe a fulfillment of what he's already told the disciples and what John records, that no man takes my life from me, but I lay it down freely. That is his conscious decision. The other thing about what I find here in these 11 verses about Jesus giving himself over to his accusers is that it is a moment when he puts himself in that position where he is obviously giving himself in the place of others. Some have described that as being vicarious. That's a word that we sometimes use to say that someone is taking your place. They're going to suffer in your place or take your punishment, something of that nature. Well, the moment that Jesus takes here to surrender is obviously a time when he's taking the place not just of his disciples, but of everyone, but specifically of his disciples in verse 9 when he says, as I just referred to, "I'm the one you're looking for, let everybody else go." I'm the one you want, I am the one you seek, let my followers go. And that was, I think, a message of his willingness to die, a fulfillment of that point where he's giving himself for others. And that's actually what Jesus had testified in the Gospel of John, I think at least 3 times, chapter 6, 9, 11 or 12, or 17. 6, 9, 17. All 3 of those, he speaks of the idea of giving himself, the idea of giving himself, and he will be alone. He gives himself alone. The thing that shines here in these 11 verses also is the fact that the reason that Jesus does it is because of his love and dedication and commitment to the mission that God has given him at this moment. When it is concluded, when Peter draws the sword and he cuts off the ear of Malchus, Jesus says, "Put away your sword." This is verse 11. "Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" There is a commitment to the mission. There is a loving response to the fact that he has to fulfill that mission, and he's going to go through with it, even though he knows exactly what he's about to go through. He knows it all. He knows everything he's about to experience. And he has already shed those tears that became like drops of blood the sweat became like drops of blood. He's already suffered through that in that Garden of Gethsemane moment. And now he has come to the conclusion, after praying to God and not being relieved of the responsibility, I must now drink of that cup. I must now drink of that cup of suffering. Verse 11. Shall I not drink of that cup that the Father has given me? There's a commitment. There's an understanding of his responsibility that he's going to follow through on because of his great love and his great responsibility that he's been given by the Father above. So when you look at all of those things in light of what we see here in these first 11 verses, Jesus was able to reach that moment from the prayer in Gethsemane to this moment when the soldiers announce their desire to arrest him, and then ultimately him saying, I'm ready for this moment to commence, this moment of suffering. And so all of that is I think a fulfillment of the prophecies about Jesus being one that would consciously give himself, and it would be that sacrifice on behalf of others as a vicarious death. And then thirdly, it is a loving sacrifice that he makes, that he understands his responsibility. Now maybe you have some observations, some comments concerning those first 11 verses of John 18. Anything? Do you find it interesting that John not only records the name of the servant whose ear was cut off, but which ear it is? An eyewitness account, right? Tommy, where are you? An eyewitness. Now, eyewitnesses cannot always be counted on to tell the right story, as any lawyer or judge will tell you. But you have an eyewitness. John was there. John was present. John saw it take place. And he even remembered which ear it was. He probably knew the fella. Is very true. He was the servant of the high priest, and any Jew would have known that for sure. Mm-hmm.
Words, he made them all stumble back and fall.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was his way of showing not only them, but the disciples, I don't have to go, but I'm going willingly. I could stop this if I wanted to. And I think that's what made Peter at that time brave. He had just witnessed that. So he was probably like, okay, let's get him, And then it was later when Jesus was not there, when he lost his courage.
Exactly. Yeah. Isn't it interesting, as Ryan brings up, that the very words of Jesus would cause this whole entourage to fall back. His suggestion is that maybe that gave Peter the courage to draw that sword. Either way, it was sure suicide for him to draw that sword. And I'm surprised he didn't have his head cut off by the time Jesus stopped him, because of all those soldiers there that if they had reacted like they had been trained, when one attacks your own, the response would have been swift and sure. And I'm surprised Peter wasn't headless right there at that moment. Yep. So, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, fortunately, Jesus fixed it like it never happened, so he put the ear back on. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's one that, Earl says, he's one that was always known to be impetuous, one that acted sometimes without thinking. He spoke, and this is one of those times when he pulled that sword and swung it.
that quick, and probably didn't think that one through.
Everything else. I'm sure Peter, had been brought up as a little Jewish person with all the scriptures and everything, and knew all the way through history. When God was with the Israelites, you could take 1,000 Israelites and kill 300,000 of the others.
Mm-hmm.
And so once Jesus said, hey, they realized who he truly was, and Jesus said that, Peter didn't have any feelings of, hey, God's with us. And that was his feelings at that point, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
So he wasn't worried about himself because, hey, God's Son was right here.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Yeah, the moment of thinking it through and understanding it all, we weren't there, so we don't know exactly, but it very well could have been from that perspective.
I wonder what they thought about when Jesus put his ear back on.
Yeah, that would have been astounding, wouldn't it?
It's funny, Luke's the one that said that. Of course, now Luke was a doctor.
Doctor,
so
yeah.
to him, that was important. We had his surgery.
Right. You got the surgery back on, yeah. Boy, if we could just do surgery that way, yeah.
One of the verses, 8 and 9, the relationship with Word. He told me, I'm the one that you see, leave the others alone. And then he said in the very next verse, this is to feel that I have lost none of them. I know he used it spiritually concerning Judas earlier, but he used it spiritually or physical there, that he did not want them to harm any of the people with him, the disciples with him.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Nelson's question is, was he talking spiritually here about having not lost any one of them? Was he talking physically about not having lost any of them? I think it's probably the same way that he was talking about chapter 17, that I've not lost a one of them. Yeah.
But the way he says that in verse 8, though, said, let them go,
Yeah.
In other words, I don't want you to harm any of them, but just take me.
Yeah, it very well could be physically, that don't harm them physically. I haven't lost any of them yet. I sent them out to the wolves, and the wolves didn't eat them, so don't harm them. Yeah.
Is this the option?
Yeah, good observation. All right, now in verses 12 and following, as a matter of fact, 12 through 27 is Jesus before Annas. And then you have, actually, I think chapter 19, the first, I don't know, maybe through about verse 16, is all of those trials of Jesus, where verse 16 of chapter 19 says, so he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So you have all of these trials that take place. And the first one of those is with Annas, the high priest, chapter 18, 12 through 27. But then that whole section would be 18, 12 through 19, 16. And that would be all of the trials of Jesus. So for us to study 18 and then come back next week and study 19, we're going to get parts and pieces. So just be aware of that, because in 12 through 27, you have Annas, who was likely in his private lodge, his private home, the father-in-law of Caiaphas. And so John makes this observation beginning in verse 12. I'll let somebody else read 12 through 27, if you would. John 18, 12 through 27.
The band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, You are also not one of them. You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? And he said, I am not. Now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire, because it was cold and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them standing and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple when all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Are those who have heard me what I said to them, they now know what I said. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I have said is right, why do you strike me? And then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Peter was standing and warming himself, so they said to him, You also are not one of the disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, Did I not seek you in the garden with me? Peter answered again, denied it, and once the rooster crowed.
Okay, very good. That's through 27. A lot of information there. Actually, two major events. Jesus before Annas, and then you have these denials of Peter. We'll come back and pick up those denials of Peter. Now, Jesus is arrested, and as John describes this appearance before Annas, notice what he says in 12, 13, and 14. They led Jesus bound, verse 12. They led him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, verse 13. Verse 14, notice this parenthetical statement he makes in verse 14. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Now that statement is made in chapter 11, verse 49 and following, where they're discussing about what to do with Jesus, and the hierarchy of the Jewish religion, or they're back and forth about what to do, and Caiaphas comes up with this universalism argument that says what's best for the group, no matter if it's immoral, is what we need to do. We need to do whatever's right for the largest number of people. It's always right to do what's good for the largest number of people, would be their theory. When actually it's always wrong to kill an innocent man. Doesn't matter how it affects the rest of the people, an innocent man can't die. You can't kill an innocent man under any circumstances. That's a moral law. It's something that preceded and outlives the law of Moses. You can't kill an innocent person. Caiaphas says, from that argument that says we need to do what's best for the largest number of people, we need to do what's best for our country, and that is kill an innocent man to save our country. So isn't it interesting that John highlights that in that verse 14, that parenthetical statement where he says we need to do what needs to be done in order to make sure that our country is saved. So what do you think Caiaphas had been doing now for quite some time concerning Jesus? Been planning his death, hadn't he? He'd been planning, searching, wondering, how in the world can we kill this Jesus, because it's better that Jesus die than for us to lose our country. It's better that Jesus die. It's better that an innocent man die than to lose our country. So for quite some time now, he had been looking for a way to kill Jesus. And he and Annas were, well, they were two of a kind, weren't they? They were peas in a pod. The idea was very strong, I think, from that perspective, when you have these people judging Jesus, an innocent man, that have already decided he needs to die. All right.
Jesus was causing controversy. The Romans had taken over. The Romans got rid of Annas in about, what, AD 15, 16, something like that, 14. And then, I guess it was them that appointed Caiaphas.
They deposed him because they couldn't get along with him. He gave them problems.
Yeah.
So they got rid of him and they appointed his son-in-law. So,
Do what they wanted.
but in the Jews' mind, he was still the high priest because they appointed high priest for life.
Mm-hmm.
So they may have been going to get a second opinion.
Yeah, from the Jewish perspective, we appoint the high priest until he dies. The Romans came in and said, we're in charge here. We're not going to let you do it that way. We're going to tell you who's going to be your high priest. And so there was this back and forth, and who knows what's going on, and whoever's going to be our little puppets, one we're going to put in there. And so you have them working together, even though the Romans felt like they had a better puppet in there than the other.
And Caiaphas had to make a decision. Annas did not make any decisions. Because Caiaphas was the Romans appointed.
The representative, yeah.
This was a kangaroo court.
Yeah, it was already made up, yeah.
It was a foregone conclusion, there was no court, there was no trial.
Yeah.
The answer was already there. The
Yes.
verdict was already there.
It is, the answer is already there. So that's why all of these 6 trials that Jesus goes through, and I say trials, it's really, none of them were really trials, it was that he would appear before, like he appeared before Annas and Caiaphas. Then there was the appearance before the Sanhedrin briefly, and then he was before Pilate, and then to Herod, and then back to Pilate. And so 6 times he stands before different groups, 3 of those Jewish and 3 of them Roman. And in all of those things, there was never a real trial. There was never witnesses. There were never any true witnesses. And there were never any who could condemn him to death. There were never any of those. And what's interesting is, in all of this, the Jews broke almost every law on the books when it came to how you deal with this kind of situation.
This was not according to Jewish law.
Not according to Jewish law, yeah. Now, again, we understand that they weren't concerned about that. It was a farce for them to come to the Romans and say, we can't kill him, we want you to do this. When Stephen made them mad, they just went ahead and killed him. They just stoned him right on the spot. Well, it was convenient for them to kill Stephen. It wasn't convenient for them to kill Jesus. And of course, it wasn't as prescribed by God either. God had prescribed already that he would be hung on a tree. Well, one of the things that was according to the Mosaic law as interpreted in the Talmud was that anyone that was arrested for a capital crime would be done in broad daylight and everything completed in daytime. Nothing will be done after dark. This is all done in the dark. Every minute of it's in the dark, except in the early morning hours when he finally gets before Pilate. When you arrest someone for a criminal crime, it cannot be based on information that you gain from a former follower of that person. There has to be 2 witnesses, and one of those cannot be a former follower because, well, we understand why. If you make somebody mad, like a former employee, you fire them, are they going to say anything good about you? Probably not. So if they want to bring something against you, then they could not be used in a Jewish court. There had to be guaranteed information or truth that was corroborated by 2 witnesses that were separate witnesses. It couldn't be Uncle Joe and Uncle Jim. It couldn't be 2 cousins. It had to be 2 that were separate. Couldn't be 2 of the same ones. Everybody was considered innocent until proven guilty. Jesus was considered guilty from the very outset. The Sanhedrin would vote one at a time, the younger men first, and then because they wouldn't be influenced by the older men. If the older men voted first, then when it comes my time, if I've only been in Sanhedrin for a couple of years, and he's, old brother Isaac over there, he's been in there 40 years, he votes yes, and I vote no, he's going to get mad at me. So I got to follow his vote, whatever that was. So they start with the youngest. One of the things that was prescribed was that they would hear the case and then go home and eat and drink lightly, considering that for what, 3 days or 2 days? Or maybe it's just 1 day. Anyway, they would do it for a period of time and then come back and rehear the whole case again. All the witnesses and everything. Didn't do it. Didn't do a thing like it was supposed to be done. It was 2 days, right here. See it, 2 days. They were to go to their homes for 2 days and nights, eating lightly, drinking only lightly, sleeping well. That's a good order. If we could just order everybody to sleep well, that'd be great, wouldn't it? I wish somebody just come in and say, "Hey, sleep well, go." I need that one. Again, come back again after the 2 days and rehear the whole testimony. All right, any other observations about his appearance before Annas, Caiaphas, and this whole kangaroo court thing that he goes through here in this reading before we get to Peter's denials? Anything? Okay, you have the three denials of Peter. Those are in verses 15 through 18 and then 25 through 27. I won't go back and reread those. You're familiar with those. You have a pretty good handle on what's taken place as Peter stands outside. By the way, John is inside with Jesus. He was allowed to go inside because he was well known. He was evidently a very influential person. He was evidently well respected, so he's able to go in with Jesus, and they left Peter outside. He was not able to go in, so he's waiting on the outside of the gate, out there by with the soldiers and others that were waiting on this event. Nowadays, it would be CNN and ABC and Fox and all those. That's who would be outside the gate. These accounts are clear. There's nothing that we can really say that's going to explain them any better, because when Peter is asked, "Aren't you a follower of his?" he denies it. Even by one who is a cousin of the man whose ear he cut off. "Didn't I see you following Jesus?" He denies it. 3 times he denies it. He was told by Jesus that before the rooster crows, which would, if a rooster is worth his salt, he's going to crow as the sun is about to rise over the horizon. If he's not worth his salt and he crows at another time, he will become stew or dumplings, according to my grandmother's rules. My daughter has one that crows all night long, beginning about 3 a.m., and that rooster will crow from about 3 a.m. till daylight, and then all day long sometimes. I told her we're going to make dumplings next time I come, and that rooster is going to be tough dumplings. But anyway, before the rooster crows, which means before daylight or somewhere around that time, you will deny me 3 times. In that context, they may leave you, but I'll never leave you. And Jesus says, "Let me tell you something, Peter. You will. 3 times. Peter didn't believe that. He did not believe that in any way. But it happened. He lost his courage. He lost the courage that he had when he drew the sword. He lost that. And he needs Right about now, he needs rescuing because he's probably at about his lowest that he's ever been in his life. All right, any observations about Peter's denials?
Peter likely was aware of the ear falling off just a little bit earlier. His connection to Jesus would have him accountable for that.
Yeah, that's one thing. Tommy reminds us that he cut the ear off, and they might still want him for that one. That might be something he's a little concerned about. All right, appreciate your comments.